Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Once again, I'd like to welcome the Honorable Lori Silver.
Well, good afternoon, and it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon. And it's not difficult to do some research and find many excellent reasons that our speaker today is here to inspire us and educate us about the challenges that this country faces. The last panel had to do with water, and our speaker is no stranger to the challenges that we face to have safe, clean drinking water, water available for fisheries, water available to protect our health and well-being. And all of those actions we can see carried out right here in our community with our Coast Keeper organization. Coast Keeper is part of a much broader alliance of water keepers that Robert Kennedy founded back in the Northeast. And it was based on the simple premise that for generations in this country, fishermen have had clean water, safe fish, to harvest for their own use, to harvest for their businesses. And in a community where increasingly toxins were being dumped into surface waters, Mr. Kennedy realized that the only thing that would stop that practice was legal action. And he has gone on to be an absolute champion to defend the environment in a series of legal actions and to raise the profile of what we are doing as a country. When we start destroying our drinking water, when we start polluting the liquid that gives us all life, then we have so much more to lose. We have so much potentially to lose. And the group that he helped found has now grown to more than 130 waterkeeper organizations, not just in the United States, but internationally. So protecting our clean, safe drinking water supply has certainly motivated him to create this global network, along with many others. Is Ken Mosher still in the room? Where is Ken Mosher? Oh, right in the very front. Ken was the original baykeeper here in San Diego, 1995, almost 20 years ago, and what is now called Coast Keeper. But this is the kind of community where it is now global, and people know one another, and there is truly a national and international unified effort to make sure that people have clean and safe drinking water. I've had the opportunity to have Mr. Kennedy come and testify when I was in the legislature. We had a joint committee hearing of the Senate and Assembly Natural Resources. He came to speak on the importance of legislation to protect the environment. He has raised the issue of mercury in our vaccinations, of autism that is exploding in its rate in our country, and the very nature of our environment has become under such incredible assault from toxics and chemical pollutants that didn't even exist a generation ago. We will never know, but we will get closer to knowing thanks to Robert Kennedy's work. We will come closer to know how it impacts our health, every one of us, our ability to live healthy, full lives, but more importantly for our children and their children, and ongoing to live full, healthy lives without a fear of breast cancer, autism, so many other diseases and illnesses that we are very closely monitoring and clearly are linked to environmental pollutants in many cases. There is one fact that I didn't know. I thought I knew a lot about Robert Kennedy Jr., but I didn't know that he is a master falconer. I didn't know that he has organized and led several expeditions in Canada and Latin America, including first descents on little-known rivers in Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. But learning that only helped me understand his heartfelt and strong connection to our wild places. You can't go down a wild river without fully appreciating that we are all inextricably linked to the water that feeds this planet. You can't ride a standing wave. You can't go down a rapid without it changing your soul and your heart. And you can't look a wild animal in the eye and become a master falconer without understanding that we are so linked to wildlife. And protecting habitat is not just about human health, but about the ecosystem and the wildlife that we are all made richer by having them around us in this world. So knowing those experiences in his life and that level of expertise only reinforce and help me understand why you fight so hard for what you fight for. It is definitely a personal and heartfelt commitment. And it is my honor today to introduce our keynote speaker, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Keepers, we now have 200 water keepers on almost all the waterways from the East Coast, from the Bay of Fundy in Canada, Biscayne Bay in Florida, Miami, and on the West Coast on most of the major waterways from Sound, Alaska, Cook Inlet, Puget Sound, Fraser River, BC, Wallowa, Willamette, Columbia, San Francisco Bay, Santa Monica Bay, San Diego Bay, we have an Orange County Coast Keeper, Santa Barbara Channel Keeper, Ventura County Coast Keeper, all the way down to Laguna San Ignacio in Mexico. We have 29 keepers now in Latin America, with the fastest growing water protection group in the world. Each one has a patrol boat. They each have a full-time paid waterkeeper, and we litigate against polluters with law enforcement. Virtually every country in the world it is illegal to pollute waterways. The problem is that these laws, these are 2,000-year-old laws. They were originally in Western law. They came to us from the Code of Justinian, which was the Roman law. It said the people on the waterways, everybody has a right to use them. Nobody can use them in a way that will diminish or injure their use and enjoyment by others. It's illegal to pollute. You use the waterway, but you can't use more than your share. And these are laws that if they were enforced, we would not only have a cleaner environment, better health, but we'd have a stronger economy as well. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about today, that link between the economy and the environment. Somebody just handed me this paper on electric supply, and he said to me, his selling point was it's how to decarbonize San Diego County, and it's all based upon market, on free market rules. And to me, and Kenny can testify to this, for 30 years as an environmental advocate, whenever anybody said to me, what's the best thing that we can do to protect the environment, I've always said the same thing, to have true free market capitalism. And I'll explain that in a little while, but I think democracy and true free market, we don't have in this country. I was with Jim Hightower the other day, and I said to him, we were talking about the free markets, and he said, yeah, the free market's a really good thing. We should try it sometime. We have, in this country, is corporate crony capitalism. It has nothing to do with free markets. Martin Luther King said that the tools of advocacy were agitation, legislation, litigation, and education. And I've done all of those for 30 years, but I would add to that innovation, because I think that there's nothing that's more important in terms of driving these new disruptive technologies into widespread use, into dominant use, and displacing the incumbents who really represent the forces of ignorance and greed. And if we had the energy of innovation, and if you release that and enervated that or energized that with true free markets, we could quickly convert this country and really solve most of the major problems that we face. And one of the things Kenny and I have talked about for many years is that we're not protecting the environment so much for the sake of the fishes and the birds, or as is too. We're protecting the environment because we recognize that nature is the infrastructure of our communities, and that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create communities for our children that provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, the shared resources of our society, what the Roman law, the Code of Justinian said, called the public trust assets, those things that are part of the commons. They're things that by their nature are not susceptible to ownership as private property, but by their nature are the possession of the entire community. The waterways, the rivers and beaches and the landscapes that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, and that are the source ultimately of our values and our virtues and our character as a people. And one of the things that you hear from the big polluters and their indentured servants in our political process is that, well, we have to choose now between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that is a false choice. That is a lie. 100% of the situations, 100% good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the big polluters are urging us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy. And we can make a few people billionaires by impoverishing the rest of us. But our children are going to pay for our joyride. And they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they'll never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the cost of our generation's prosperity on the backs of our children. And one of the things I've done over the past 33 decades as an environmental advocate is to constantly go around and confront this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications and road construction. It's an investment we have to make if we're going to ensure the economic vitality of our generation and future generations. And, anybody who reads the papers can see that they virtually all of the major issues, big major challenges that we face as a civilization, as a government, as a nation, are almost all rooted in one way or the other in how we use energy, how we extract it, how we deploy it, how we distribute it, how we mobilize it, how we own it. And whether it's Fukushima or the BP oil spill, or the war in Iraq, or the giant trade deficits, and you can keep on going. All of these really, the health issues, and Laura was talking about the cancer issues and these other issues. They're almost all of them are rooted in how we use energy. And the question is, can we do those things? We need energy to make our civilization work and to keep us prosperous. Can we find sources of it? Can we distribute it? Can we use it in a way that doesn't compromise the aspirations of future generations and destroy our health and destroy our civic life and subvert our democracy and do all these bad things that erode our values and affect our all of the things that we care most deeply about? In November of last year, Lord David Putnam gave a speech before Parliament, actually 2 years ago, when Parliament was debating a cap-and-trade system that's very similar to the one that we had with the Waxman Markey Bill that passed our Congress and then was stopped in the Senate by the oil industry in the Senate and the coal industry. And it was the keystone of President Obama's national energy policy, which kind of fell apart after that. And in England, they had a bill that was actually much tougher, and to its credit, Parliament ultimately passed that bill. During the debate over its passage, Lord David Putnam was one of the great progressive thinkers of Europe, and he's also a great filmmaker. He made Chariots of Fire and a bunch of other films. He's one of the most respected members of Parliament today. Made a speech, and in England, virtually everybody accepts the scientific reality behind global warming. They understand that it's a grim reality that government has to lead the way in addressing it. But there are still vested interests and others who say, well, we have to move incrementally, we have to move slowly, because if we move too quickly, if we move precipitously, it's going to cause grave dislocations in our marketplace. And it's going to impede our capacity to address this and other problems, and our economy is going to crater. And Lord Putnam reminded Parliament that exactly 200 years before, the same institution had debated the abolition of the slave trade. And at that time in England, virtually everybody was against slavery and wanted to see the trade abolished. They regarded it as an abomination, a moral catastrophe that had to be eradicated. The question was, how do you do it? Because slavery represented, at that time, 25% of the GNP of Great Britain. It was the principal source of energy for the entire British Empire. Free human labor. And people said, if we abolish it overnight, the economy is going to collapse. But after a year of debate, Parliament literally abolished it overnight. And instead of collapsing, the British economy exploded as thousands of entrepreneurs rushed into that space to create new forms of energy, mainly mechanical ones, in an era that we now know as the Industrial Revolution, which was the greatest epic in wealth creation in the history of mankind. And the abolition of the slave trade had exposed all of these hidden inefficiencies that were associated with free human bondage. Well, today, we don't need to abolish carbon to understand that our deadly addiction to it is the principal drag on American capitalism. We are spending $1 billion, borrowing $1 billion a day, mainly from nations that don't share our values, the United States, $1 billion a day, in order to import $1 billion of oil every day. Again, largely from nations that don't share our values. Some of them are actively hostile to us. We are, in essence, funding both sides of the war against terror through our addiction to oil, to foreign oil. We give to the oil industry hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies every year, the richest industry in the history of mankind. And if you have doubts about that number, look at Terry Tammany's new book. Terry Tammany, as many of you know, used to be the Santa Monica Bay keeper, and then went on to be the head of the EPA for the state of California. He's written a book since he stepped down at EPA called Lives Per Gallon, and he has meticulously and scrupulously inventoried this vast raft of subsidies that we hand over to big oil every year, and he adds it up very convincingly to be about $1.3 trillion. The direct federal subsidies are about $56 billion a year. They vary a little bit. That's the oil depletion allowance, the suspension of royalties, the oil companies on federal lands, and all of these various kind of tax programs to benefit big oil. But in addition to that, you have the indirect subsidies, the $100 billion we spend every year protecting the pipelines in the Arabian Gulf. We have 44 bases on the border, or around the borders of Iran, and that we maintain permanently. And it's about $100 billion a year. plus hundreds of billions of dollars a year in healthcare costs, crop damage, all these other costs. But Tamanin doesn't even look at the cost of the BP oil spill, the Exxon Valdez spill, or the war in Iraq, which in fairness should all be billed to big oils and drought, because we wouldn't be in those messes and if it weren't for our addiction to oil. So, and the number he comes up with, even without those costs, 1.3 trillion. We give about $500 billion annually in subsidies to the nuke industry. I remember when I was a kid that I'm saying it's going to be too cheap to meter, and it's turned out to be the most catastrophically expensive way to boil the bottled water that's ever been devised, and that's without the cost of disposing of their waste, which we now have to store for 30,000 years, which is 5 times the length of recorded human history. And then coal, which may be the most highly subsidized of all. Nobody's ever really done a study, although all the information is public. It'd be a great, it would be a great subject for a PhD thesis or a master's thesis of what the true costs of coal are. Because if you talk to the utilities, or the industry, or the railroad or coal industry, they'll say it was about 11 cents a kilowatt hour. But they're not talking. They won't tell you. They won't talk to you about the hidden costs of coal. I've been suing the coal industry for as long as I've been doing this, and I actually, about 2 years ago, I was in West Virginia, where about a lot of lawsuits against big coal. And I had a 6.5-week jury trial in the state, and we won the biggest judgment in the history of the state of West Virginia. So I went back about 6 months ago to argue the appeal of that case in front of the West Virginia Supreme Court. And as I was leaving the courthouse going back to the airport, we were being driven on a highway that felt like, it was so smooth, it felt like a skateboard park, or, like almost like we're on a carpet. And this is very unusual in West Virginia. West Virginia has probably the worst roads in the country. My father used to say about the West Virginia, it's the richest state in the country if you look at the resources below the land. But it's 49th in terms of the poverty of the people. So anybody who argues that coal has done something good at West Virginia should just go down there and take a look at the state, because it's a mess. And coal has not brought wealth to the people of that state. It's been brought wealth to Wall Street at the expense of the people who live in the state of West Virginia. But the normal roads are horrible, but they have 3,000 miles of coal roads. And I said to the driver of the car, why does this road feel so, like we're driving on a cushion? He said, because there's 22 inches of asphalt on this road. Well, the Massachusetts Turnpike has 4 inches, and the New York State Thruway has about 6 to 8 inches. And every inch costs millions of dollars per lane, per mile. And I knew why those West Virginia roads had 22 inches of asphalt on them. Because the coal trucks weigh 90,000 pounds, and they'll pulverize a road that's less robust. So, and that was an interstate highway, so you and I are paying for that road. But the benefits go to the coal industry, and they don't have to pay it. You and I pay it. So that's one of the costs of coal that they don't tell you about when they say, oh, it's only 11 cents a kilowatt hour. They're not telling you that out of the other pocket, you're also paying for 3,000 miles of coal roads in West Virginia, and about the same amount in Kentucky, and all over the country. One of the reasons we can't have high-speed rail in this country is because virtually every railroad track in America has been warped by the coal gondolas because they're so heavy. And that's another cost, hidden cost of coal, that they don't tell you about when they say, oh, it's only 11 cents a kilowatt hour. 2 years ago in August, the National Academy of Sciences released a study, a 10-year study, that showed that every freshwater fish in America now has dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. And this includes the saltwater fish like tuna and shark and swordfish. But every single freshwater fish in America, every one that they tested, and there is no safe level of mercury. And the mercury is coming from coal-burning power plants. We are living today in this country in a science fiction nightmare, where my children, the children of most Americans, can now no longer engage in the seminal primal activity of American youth. which is to go fishing with their father and mother in the local fishing hole and then come home and safely eat the fish. As Laura pointed out, the CDC has recognized a connection between autism and mercury, not in vaccines, but in fish. And EPA has too. It's kind of, it's insane thinking. But I have a book about to come out on the issue of the mercury, which is still in the vaccines, incidentally, although sometimes they like to say that it isn't, but I went through 649 peer-reviewed studies just to see what the science says, and it's very clear and it's very frightening. But without going into that area, the CDC acknowledges that there's a connection between autism and mercury in fish. And today, according to CDC, 1 out of every 6 American women now has dangerous levels of mercury in her womb. And there are 640,000 children who are born in this country every year who've been exposed to dangerous levels of mercury in their mother's wombs, levels high enough to cause heart disease, liver disease, mental retardation, IQ loss, and a number of other ailments. That's another cost of coal that they don't tell you about when they say it's only 11 cents a kilowatt hour. If you go back to home tonight, look at your EPA's website, you'll see a study there by the Harvard School of Public Health that shows that ozone particulates, which is another class of pollutants from coal-burning power plants, kill between 47,000 and 60,000 Americans every year. That's 20 times the number of people who were killed in the World Trade Center attacks, but not just once, year after year after year after year. According to those same studies, the cost of ozone particulates to just on respiratory diseases, it caused 10 million asthma attacks a year. There are 1 million lost work days, but the cost is $345 billion. We could pay for Obamacare 5 or 10 times over just by eliminating ozone particulates from coal-burning power plants. So this is another cost that they don't tell you about, and they say it's 11 cents a kilowatt hour. The acid rain is another pollutant, which has destroyed the forest cover on the high peaks of the Appalachians from Georgia to northern Quebec, and sterilized 1 out of every 5 lakes in the Adirondack Mountains and in most of the higher elevation areas of the entire Appalachian chain. And that's another cost that they don't tell you about when they say, oh, it's only 11 cents a kilowatt hour. When I flew out of the state this last time around, I flew over the Cumberland Plateau, which if the American people could see what I saw, I believe there'd be a revolution in our country. This is something that could not happen in the Sierra Nevada. It could not happen in the state of California. But the people in West Virginia and democracy in that state are so bedraggled and beleaguered and beaten down that it can happen there. But we are literally cutting down the Appalachian Mountains with these giant machines called drag lines that are 22 stories high. I flew under one of them in a Piper Cub, the biggest machines on earth. It cost $500 million for a single machine. And they practically dispensed with the need for human labor, which indeed is the point. My father was fighting strip mining in Appalachia back in the 60s, and back then the strips were tiny compared to what they are today. I remember a conversation that I had with him when I was 14 years old, where he said to me that not just destroying the environment, they're permanently impoverishing these communities, because there's no way that they can ever regenerate an economy from these barren states that are left behind. And he said they're doing it so they can break the unions. And that's exactly what they did. When he told me that there were 149,000 unionized mine workers just in West Virginia digging coal out of tunnels in the ground. Today, there are fewer than 14,000 miners in the state. 9 out of 10 of those jobs have been eliminated, not by environmental rules, but by a ruthless, deliberate, and systematic strategy by the coal industry to eliminate jobs and replace them with machines and explosives. And today, with 1/10 the workforce, they're taking more coal out of West Virginia than they were in 1968. The only difference is back then, at least some of that money was being left in the state for salaries and pensions and reinvestment in the community. Right now, it all goes up to Wall Street, to Peabody Coal and Massey Coal and Consolidated and the big banking houses like Wells Fargo, Citibank, and JP Morgan Chase that fund these operations. 95% of the coal in West Virginia is owned by Wall Street interests, by out-of-state companies. And the wealth is being transferred right up there. And they, of course, can manipulate the political process so that they can liquidate the state for cash. And that's exactly what they're doing. According to, they're using these big machines and 2,500 tons of ammonia nitrate explosives they detonate every day in West Virginia. It's the equivalent of a Hiroshima bomb once a week. They're blowing off the tops of the mountains to get at the coal seams beneath, and they take the rock, debris, and rubble, and they scrape it into the adjacent river valley. According to EPA, they have cut down 500 of the biggest mountains in West Virginia over the past 10 years. They have flattened an area of the Appalachians larger than the state of Delaware, 1.4 million acres. Imagine if they cut down one mountain in the state of California, you would put them in jail. But they've cut down 500 mountains in West Virginia. They buried 2,200 miles of rivers and streams and poisoned thousands of miles more, all the way down to the Ohio River and the Missouri and the Mississippi, and then down to the East Coast too, through the Roanoke, the Tar, the New River, the estuaries that flow into the Atlantic. So, and it's all illegal. You cannot in the United States take rock and debris and rubble and dump it into a waterway without a Clean Water Act permit. You can never get a permit to do such a thing. So we sued them. And we won the lawsuit in front of a conservative Republican federal judge, Charles Hayden. He passed away last year. But, and Judge Hayden said the same thing I did. He said it's all illegal, it's been illegal since day one, and he enjoined all mountaintop mining. So it all had to stop. And 2 days from when they got that decision, lobbyists from Massey Coal and Peabody Coal met in the back door of Gail Norton's Interior Department with her first deputy chief, Stephen J. Griles, who's now serving a 10.5-month jail sentence in the federal penitentiary, and who was a former lobbyist for Massey Coal and Peabody Coal. And together they rewrote the interpretation of one word, the Clean Water Act, the definition of the word fill, to change 30 years of statutory interpretation and effectively overrule Judge Hayden's decision and make it legal as it is today, not just in West Virginia, but in California and every other state, to dump rock, debris, rubble, garbage, any solid material into any waterway in the United States without a Clean Water Act permit. All you need today is a rubber stamp permit from the Corps of Engineers, which in some districts you can get over the telephone or through the mail. And this is why I always say, wherever you see large-scale destruction of the environment, you'll also see the subversion of our democracy. You'll see the destruction of the democratic process on the local level, the deprivation of zoning laws and planning laws that's taken away from local people, the ability to zone out these operations so that the transparency disappears. The agencies become captive of the industries they're supposed to regulate. They become sock puppets for those industries, and then the corruption of politicians, and also the subversion of the press. You see all of that, in just black and white across West Virginia. And it's not, you can't even say that there is democracy in that state anymore. It's a company town. And that's what they want to do to this whole country. It is a colonial model economy where, they are getting the wealth and the rest of us and the environments are simply commodities for them. And in order to do that, they've got to break the law. And in order to break the law, they have to compromise the democratic process. And there's a cost to that, which is probably the highest costing item in their inventory. We can't really reduce it to dollars and cents, but it's a cost to all of us to lose our democracy in this country, and we're seeing that happen. What's happening in West Virginia is happening everywhere now, particularly because of the Citizens United case, which is the death knell for American democracy. And this isn't shrill hyperbole. This is something we are seeing, throughout this election, and you'll see it right here in San Diego. In the upcoming, in the congressional elections, et cetera, you're going to see it. This huge influx of corporate money that is twisting and distorting American democracy. And one of the first things that they do, the first thing that happens in every tyranny is for powerful entities within a society to privatize the public trust and to turn it into profit for themselves. And that always going back through the Dark Ages, all through the Eastern Europe, the communists, China, Russia, or Latin America, wherever you see tyranny, you'll also see the privatization of the public trust. You see the destruction of the air, the water, the rivers, and it's all privatized. And that's one of the things that we're seeing. We know this. We know that every nation that has decarbonized its economy has experienced instantaneous prosperity. Iceland in 1970 was the poorest country in Europe. It was 100% dependent on imported coal and oil. And the government of Iceland decided that they wanted to change that because they were frightened of global warming, which impacts the northern latitudes disproportionately. And again, there were naysayers who said we can't move so quickly, but God, Iceland moved very deliberately. Within 15 years, they completely decarbonized the country and made Iceland 100% energy independent. 98% of the electric grid is now geothermal, local-based geothermal. And Iceland went from being the poorest country in Europe during that period to being the fourth richest country in the world by GDP. Unfortunately for Iceland, they spent virtually all of their newfound wealth on bundled derivatives. And they are now, once again, the poorest country in Europe. But Iceland's economy is rebounding, and it will rebound because the foundations are now strong, because Iceland is one of the world's great energy exporters. They can't run lines across the Atlantic. They have huge surpluses now of energy in Iceland. They will, incidentally, soon be able to run lines across the Atlantic because England, Great Britain is building, under Gordon Brown's plan, these giant wind farms in the North Sea that are close enough to Iceland, so they're going to build a connector grid, and then they'll be able to sell their electricity directly to Europe, and they're going to get really, really rich. But right now, what they do is they import bauxite from Jamaica. They use the big surplus to smelt the bauxite into aluminum, and they sell the ingots in the world market as their way of exporting energy. Sweden, in 1997, decided to decarbonize their society, and incidentally, to close down their nuclear power industry. They shut down their two biggest nuke plants. They slapped $150 a ton tax on carbon. And Sweden today, I think, is something like the 8th richest country by GDP in the world. The important thing about Sweden is that its energy use went down by 9%, and its economy during the same time climbed by 45%. Brazil, 20 years ago, decarbonized its transportation system, and as a direct result of that decision, Brazil today is enjoying the longest, most robust economic expansion in the history of Latin America. Brazil this year replaced France as the 5th richest country in the world. Costa Rica at the same time decarbonized their electric grid, and Costa Rica, partially as a result of that choice, Costa Rica made a lot of other good choices too, including not having an army. And as a result,